Great. Well, thanks very much. It's wonderful to be able to kind of kick off this great meeting. So I'm going to be telling you today about some of the options for pulse sequences, and I've kind of taken it as a bit of a task. I know many of you would have been in the boot camp yesterday, but I thought I would kind of start us off slightly slowly, and then we'll pick up rapidly as time goes on, and I'm sure at a frenzied pace by the end of my talk here. So, okay, so first off, just to remind everyone, what is diffusion? I'm sure I don't need to tell you this. It's basically random motion of, in our case, water molecules due to thermal energy, and they're sort of colliding with each other, and that causes displacement. And the reason why that is interesting to us is because although in unrestricted spaces, so if you have just water in a glass or a beaker, those molecules will sort of follow a completely random walk. Their pathways and their ability to move are restricted by the presence of tissue boundaries and membranes. And so that then creates this really powerful marker for tissue microstructure. And that's obviously the thing that we're going to be focusing on throughout all of this meeting, is what that can tell us about tissue that's useful both for understanding tissue health and tissue pathology. One of the more interesting effects, of course, that we hear about a lot is diffusion anisotropy. So in some tissues, diffusion is anisotropic, so it has a preferred orientation. And the classic example here, although by no means the only example of diffusion anisotropy, is that we have sort of cylindrical-ish axons in white matter, and that means that we have a preferred orientation. Okay, so I'm not going to go into any more depth than that. We'll hear all about this over the coming talks, but I just wanted to make sure that we have a sort of a common baseline. So in terms of going through diffusion pulse sequences, the way that I think about this is that it's sort of modular. There's two components to the pulse sequence. The first is how you achieve diffusion weighting. In other words, how you impart contrast in your image that tells you about the process of diffusion. And then the second is how the image is acquired. And although those two things relate to each other, and there are different decisions that are sensible based on exactly what the tissue is that you're studying, or other aspects like how much motion there is in the tissue that you're looking at. It is largely the case that those two things are separate, and so I'm going to treat them as if they're completely separate, and then if people are interested, we can talk about ways in which they interact later on. So I'm going to begin with how we achieve diffusion weighting. And I'm going to start with the classic spin echo. I'm sure most people here are familiar with this, but I think it's useful to go through what it is that we generally use before we talk about some of the more exotic things that can be done instead. So as we all know, the way that we're going to achieve diffusion weighting is based on precession, right? So this first most basic aspect of MR physics, where once we excite the magnetization, it undergoes this sort of funny rotation. And specifically what we're going to take advantage of is the fact that, oops, if I can get rid of that, that precession is proportional to the magnetic field. And normally we think of this as being proportional to the main magnetic field, but of course one of the tricks that we have throughout all of MRI is to slightly offset that magnetic field. And in this case what we're going to do is we're going to create offsets using our gradients, but we're going to do something different than we normally do with respect to forming an image. And the key effect that's going to create contrast is dephasing. Okay? So dephasing is an effect that happens where we have a range of frequencies for some reason, and there are many different reasons why we might have a range of frequencies, but we have a range of frequencies within a voxel, and so what happens is after excitation that magnetization fans out. So different parts of your voxel precess at different rates, and what that leads to is a rapid signal loss. So the trick that we're going to play then is after excitation, we're going to use what's called a refocusing pulse. And this is just a 180-degree pulse that flips that magnetization. And so it causes it to return basically to where we first excited it. Now, looking at a single spin here, it's easy to see what's happening, but it's not necessarily easy to see what the significance of this is until I show you what happens under the conditions where we normally would have signal dephasing. So if we look at a range of off-resonance values, when the magnetization fans out, if we use this 180-degree pulse, what it does is for every component of that magnetization, regardless of how fast it's processing, it puts it in exactly the right spot for it to return to where it began, simultaneous with all of the other magnetization. Okay? So this is quite a magical little trick that we have in order to be able to remove those effects of dephasing. Now, oftentimes, we're using this to remove effects of dephasing we don't want. In diffusion imaging, we are going to use this very purposefully to create our signal contrast. So under dephasing then, in a spin echo, what we see is that the signal rapidly decays due to dephasing, and then after this 180-degree pulse, it returns back to the signal level that it would have if there were no dephasing. So this dotted line here represents T2, pure T2 signal decay. So what we get is called an echo. You can see the signal kind of echoes back. So this is the fundamental basis for most diffusion imaging, and the way that we use this is to take this standard spin echo sequence. So this is like what you might use in, for example, like a T2 weighted structural scan, and we're going to modify it by adding 2 gradients. And I've labeled those here as position encode and position decode, which gives you some kind of feeling for what they're doing. So these gradients are not going to be used to form the image. They're going to be used to impart contrast, and specifically contrast that relates to diffusion. So what that looks like, here what I'm showing you is what the spins in a voxel might be doing. So here's our voxel. And what I'm showing you in color coding here, from yellow to red, is representing that gradient that we've added. So what you'll see is that after excitation, each component of the magnetization is going to process according to its local magnetic field. Okay? And what you can see in the middle here is a plot of the signal over time. Okay? So if we just watch what happens when there's no diffusion, every spin is rotating according to its local field. We flip it by 180 degrees, and then it continues rotating on. And we get exactly that pattern that I showed you before. It's now distributed in a very organized way across the voxel, but what you saw was exactly the same effect. Within a voxel, the magnetization fanned out, and then it came back together again. Okay, so that's the case of no diffusion. If we now look at what happens when water molecules are moving, what we see is that that pattern initially is quite well organized, but over time, you see now there's the flip of 180 degrees. Molecules have moved relative to where they began, and so that means that we no longer get that perfect refocusing of the signal, although you'll see that there's still here a general tendency for magnetization vectors to be pointing toward the right, but they're no longer perfectly coherent. And so what we've created then is a signal loss. And that signal loss then is proportional to, not proportional, it is very closely tied to the rate of diffusion in that tissue type. So the faster diffusion is, the less signal that we have. And that is fundamentally the contrast that all diffusion imaging methods employ. Okay, so that is the basic diffusion-weighted spin echo. Hopefully I haven't bored too many because I know most of you will be familiar with this. This is by far our most common method that we use for diffusion imaging. It has very few image artifacts. It's an extremely efficient way of imparting diffusion contrast to tissue. The one Achilles heel that it has is it has a relatively long echo time, and that creates strong T2 decay, which I believe I'll come back to a bit later. Okay, so that's the basics of what we normally do. What else can we do? As it turns out, this concept of diffusion gradients is a very generalizable form, and the one example that I like to give, even though it's one that we almost never use in practice, is a diffusion-weighted gradient echo, because this actually is kind of the most basic, fundamental way of thinking about diffusion contrast, which is that instead of having 2 gradients that have the same polarity, we're going to have them with opposite polarity. And so if you look at this, one characteristic of this is that the area in total underneath these 2 gradients is 0 because they cancel each other out. One's positive, one is negative. And once again, these gradients are going to encode position and then decode position. So if we look at what this would look like then, now instead of flipping the spins halfway through, we're going to flip the gradient halfway through. Okay, so magnetization, exactly the same thing as what we saw before. It evolves over time in this very orderly way if we don't have diffusion. Now we flip the gradient. And now what we've done is create essentially the same condition, which is that each spin now has the opposite field offset to what it had before. And so again, they all come back into alignment. And again, if we look at that under the case of diffusion, water molecules are moving around. Halfway through, we flip the gradient. And now, as magnetization continues bumping around, again, we have this loss of coherence, loss of signal. Okay, so the gradient echo is really nice for sort of giving you this general picture of how to think about what a diffusion weighting module does fundamentally. It's important to be able to put things in this context of no net area under these two gradients, because that tells you that anything that is stationary essentially is unperturbed by those gradients. Anything that is moving is going to have a net phase imparted to it. And in particular, in the case of diffusion, where we have this chaotic random motion, that creates dephasing. Okay? Now, in practice, I'm actually not aware of any situation where people use this particular sequence in the context of diffusion contrast. The problem is that it has intense T2 star signal loss, okay? Other sources of dephasing create signal loss, and in particular, if you were to get an image with this, you would see something that looks like this. So those of you who are familiar with fMRI, this is a common artifact we have in fMRI. fMRI is another gradient echo technique. We have these intense regions of signal dropout, okay? And that's because we have strong field inhomogeneity there. Basically, a field inhomogeneity that is kind of similar in some ways to what we have with these gradients, but now it's not a zero net area. Okay, so in practice we don't use this, but it's a really useful way of looking at diffusion sequences. If we look here at the spin echo that I was showing you before, one trick that we have, that we often deploy in terms of trying to understand contrast in sequences is to realize that whenever you have a 180 in a sequence, you can effectively consider it to flip all of the gradient pulses that preceded it. So from that perspective, this spin echo is doing exactly the same thing as the gradient echo. Because we have this 180 here, this is in effect a negative gradient with respect to this one. Now, as it turns out, there's lots of sequences that you can see that fit into precisely this same general format. And I'm going to briefly take you through these. So stimulated echoes, hyperechoes, and one that's very near and dear to my heart, which is called steady state free precession. These are less commonly used than the spin echo, but they have some properties that are interesting and kind of important for people to know about, because they enable you to do, on occasion, some things that you can't do with spin echoes. So if we start with the stimulated echo, this is probably the second most common sequence to use. In this case, you can think of this as very similar to a spin echo, but now instead of having a 180-degree pulse, we've broken it into two 90s. Okay? And that can be useful for a number of reasons that I'll get into in a moment. But again, basically, in terms of understanding the sequence, you can think of this as a 180. And so again, this gradient here, which actually has a positive amplitude, is in effect negated. And so you see we have the same contrast of two opposing gradients. One of the benefits of this stimulated echo sequence is that we can actually achieve quite long times between these two excitation pulses here. And that can be useful for achieving long diffusion times. So before I get into why that is useful, let me just walk you through what this looks like. This is kind of interesting to see what this sequence actually does in practice, so how the magnetization behaves. So I'm going to show you now essentially the same type of animation as I showed you for the spin echo, but now it's going to be stimulated echo. And in particular, pay attention, there's these two 90-degree pulses here, but also critically, these pulses here, which are called spoilers, are going to play a critical role in what happens. So we excite the magnetization, it fans out, and now what we do is we tip it 90 degrees, and then critically, we remove the bits of it that were in the transverse plane. Okay? And then we tip it back into the transverse plane, and we bring it back into alignment. And the critical thing about having to remove the signal that was in the transverse plane is that if we don't remove that signal, we bring it back in a way that is difficult to control. In particular, we also would have some contributions where we excite signal from this 90-degree pulse, and we don't want that. So it's absolutely critical that we have these two what are called spoiler gradients. Let me just play that for you again. So you can see it, so magnetization fans out. We tip it 90 degrees. We remove the transverse component with those green gradients, tip it back into the transverse plane, and then bring it back together. Okay, so why in God's name would we want to do this? Actually, before I get to that, one of the key, actually no, I'm going to go to this first. So one of the reasons why we would want to do this is because it allows us to achieve long diffusion times. Okay, so for example, we can have potentially an extremely long period between these two 90-degree pulses, and that's useful because remember that during this period here, the magnetization was along the longitudinal axis. And that means that it's decaying according to the time constant T1, which is much longer than T2. During that period, water molecules are still diffusing. So we're still accumulating contrast. So there's two reasons why we might want to do that. One is simply if we have a short T2. Okay? If we have a short T2, during these periods here and here, we are losing signal according to T2. Okay? But in a spin echo, all of our signal loss is according to T2. So we have this kind of fundamental link between the diffusion contrast that we can create due to these gradients and the amount of T2 signal loss that we have. In stimulated echo, what we've done is we've uncoupled those two things. We've enabled us to sort of dial in whatever time we want here to accumulate contrast, whilst being able to keep these periods short to reduce the effect of T2. Okay? So that's one reason, if you have a really short T2 species. The other reason why you might want to do this is to achieve what's called a long diffusion time. So this is the time between this pulse and this pulse. And that partly is, I mean, essentially it's kind of the same point. You're accumulating contrast, but very specifically, it enables you to get a look at the process of diffusion over long time periods. So for example, if you had, let's say you had something like two fibers that were crossing in the white matter, and you wanted to increase the amount of the time you allow for water molecules to explore that environment so that you can have a more comprehensive description of that relatively complex architecture, increasing the diffusion time would potentially allow you to do that. Okay, so let me go back briefly to these gradients, because one of the things that I kind of skipped over here is the fact that when we do this spoiling here, what we've done is remove signal. Okay, we fundamentally have lost signal. So this spoiling process immediately loses 50% of the signal, and that is one of the big disadvantages of stimulated echoes. And so there's kind of this trade-off. If you're doing this because you have, for example, a short T2 species, there is this fundamental trade-off of, is it worth it? I've already lost 50% of my signal, so is the gain that I get due to that reduced T2 or the longer diffusion time, is it worth that cost? It's also the case that, for those of you who think about pulse sequences, that this is a good example where things that work very well in spin echoes, you have to start thinking a little bit more carefully, because suddenly things can creep up that you don't normally have to worry about in a spin echo, but which you might have to worry about in a stimulated echo. And one of the obvious examples here is that we have these additional gradients, these green gradients, which are our spoilers. So the only reason why we need these gradients is to try to remove that signal so that we don't have problematic signal that is not reflecting the diffusion process that we want. Okay, but if you look at it, fundamentally, there's really no difference between these spoiler gradients and these diffusion encoding gradients. They're essentially the same thing, which means that if you aren't careful, you can intend, for example, to get diffusion directions that look like this and accidentally end up with a completely different set of directions. And this is something you don't need to worry about in a spin echo because we don't tend to make this time long. In a spin echo, this time basically doesn't exist, so it doesn't contribute any diffusion contrast. So this is a good example of where, once we start embarking on some of these alternate sequences, you have to be quite thoughtful and careful because artifacts or effects will creep up that you didn't have to worry about before. Okay. So another interesting example of the use of stimulated echo has been in the heart. So I have to say, I'm absolutely amazed when I went around looking for a good example of heart imaging. There's this beautiful review here talking about what people how far people have gotten with diffusion imaging in the heart. I'm astounded by these pictures of, I believe this is an in vivo tractography where they're looking at helical angle in the heart. And stimulated echo has been one of the more dominant techniques in the area of heart imaging because it has this nice property, again, of having a controllable period in between these two 90-degree pulses. And so one trick that people play in the heart is that you basically cardiac gate this sequence. So you will essentially do the initial excitation at one point in the heartbeat, you tip the magnetization longitudinally, and then you wait for the next heartbeat, with the idea that basically motion in the heart then is essentially going to be time-locked. And so it's really remarkable how that this works at all, but this is one of the dominant techniques that people have been using. I believe people are actually starting to kind of increasingly move to other areas. So I wouldn't want to speculate as to whether this is going to be how people are doing this in the near future, but it certainly is one interesting use of stimulated echoes. Okay, so if we move on to something slightly more exotic, this is what's called a hyperecho. So again, what you see is gradients that are matched. Now, one important point here is that although so this is 180, this is another 180, you might think that that totals 360. I haven't very unhelpfully not shown you that basically these are about different axes. So in effect, each of these axes is sort of an independent 180. This is very similar to a stimulated echo, but intriguingly, it doesn't lose that factor of 2 in signal. So this is something that people got very excited about in the early 2000s when it was introduced. It's relatively unexplored, and there probably are quite good reasons for that. But I think it's quite an interesting one to look at for purposes of again, seeing what you can do in terms of spin manipulation. So I'm just briefly going to show you what this sequence looks like, because it's kind of cool. So it's going to look initially very much like the stimulated echo I was showing you, and then in the middle, this is the key thing that doesn't exist in a stimulated echo. So watch what happens when we get to that. So we excite the magnetization, it fans out, we tip it longitudinally, and now what we do is we actually just rotate it rather than spoiling it. And what that rotator does is basically equivalent to what a spin echo does. It just prepares the magnetization in exactly the right way so that when you bring it back, the gradient pulse the effect of that gradient pulse is exactly reversed. And so the cool thing about this then, we don't have to lose that factor of 2 signal. Now, my understanding, I've never worked with these sequences, my understanding is that they're quite fritzy to work with. You really have to have high accuracy on the RF pulses for this to work. But it is something that I would be very excited to see people start working with, because it does seem really intriguing. Finally, as I said, near and dear to my heart, steady state free precession. So this is another slightly funny sequence. What I'm showing you here is not a single TR period, I'm showing you 2. So what the sequence basically does, if we just look at, actually let's just look at the latter half of it here. You excite the magnetization, you play a gradient, and then you acquire some signal. And that is a really funny thing to do. Because what it looks like, if you ignore the first half of this, what it looks like is that you excite some signal, you spoil it out, and then you acquire an image, which shouldn't give you anything sensible. But the way that this sequence works is it actually establishes pairs of gradients over multiple TRs. The key point here is that the magnetization that you excite in this period persists, because we use a very short repetition time. So the magnetization is persisting from one period to the next. That's a characteristic of all steady state free precession sequences, is the fact that we very specifically don't try to spoil out any of the signal. We keep it all around. And so what happens then is you excite signal here, it sees this gradient, it is either left alone here or potentially sees effective an additional 180 pulse, and then it sees this gradient again. And so part of the signal looks like a spin echo. As it turns out, other parts of the signal look an awful lot like stimulated echoes. This sequence gets signal from many different TR periods and from what we refer to as many different coherence pathways, which is not something I have time to go into. Now, as a result of that, it's a very mixed bag. It turns out it's really good for short T2 because these periods are short, so the time between when you excite and when you acquire is relatively short. It's extremely contrast to noise ratio efficient, so it has high contrast for the amount of time, like per unit time. However, it's an incredibly complicated signal dependence. I won't show you the equation, but it basically takes up the better part of a page. The B value, I haven't really gone into B value, but the level of diffusion contrast that you have is ill-defined. Just as important, it's extremely motion sensitive. And this SSFP sequence is one of the first diffusion-weighted sequences that was proposed. But people very quickly realized that it's extremely motion sensitive because of the fact that you have the signal persisting for many, many periods. And so here, I'm showing you a knee. So even in the knee where things barely move, you have pretty extreme motion sensitivity, creating these artifacts. But even with a correction, you don't get really beautiful images. Here in a brain, you can see there's some motion sensitivity. You might ask why there's much motion sensitivity in the brain. I'll come back to that a bit later. That said, it is very good for short T2 species. So here, for example, in cartilage, if you can get a good cleanup of the signal, cartilage has very short T2, very difficult to get diffusion contrast in, and this sequence does work for that. I spent an awful lot of my career trying to make this work in the brain, and the motion sensitivity is really difficult to deal with, so I took the somewhat unconventional approach of just going to dead things. Which, as it turns out, have very short T2. And this has turned out to be a really nice way of getting beautiful images in postmortem tissue. Okay, so that's how we achieve diffusion weighting, or at least those are a few of the possibilities for achieving diffusion weighting. The second part of any given diffusion pulse sequence is how we acquire the image. And again, this is somewhat independent of how you prepare the magnetization to have diffusion contrast. So let's just start off again with what the most conventional thing is, which is echoplanar imaging, and then I'll tell you a little bit about alternatives to that. So as I said, in theory, any acquisition could be used. So I've just had this box sort of sitting off by itself with the word acquisition in it, very purposely not specifying how we actually create the image. In theory, we could do anything, but in practice, motion sensitivity dictates what's possible. So here, for example, is work from Kim Butts, where she was addressing this problem. So here I'm just showing you sort of the before image. If you acquire diffusion-weighted images over multiple shots, so in other words, instead of using a snapshot technique like EPI, do something more like what we do for structural images, where you excite the magnetization multiple times and you form the image over many different excitations. What you will see is an image that looks kind of like this. This is actually a brain. I know it's not totally easy to see that that's what it is. But basically what we've done by introducing diffusion gradients is we create an aspect of the signal that is motion sensitive. And if you think about the size of motions that we have in diffusion, they're on the order of tens of microns, sort of something like 50 microns. If you think about trying to require a subject to hold still to that precision, even the best, most compliant graduate student is incapable of doing that, right? So the problem is subject motion also gets encoded. And as soon as you have different motions from different excitations, it leads to an image that looks like this, which is just completely unusable. So, right, can motion be avoided? Well, okay, so you can do some things. You know, you can kind of tape people down and give them, mouth, what do you call them? Yeah, that thing. But the point is, even if you can get the subject not to exhibit any rigid body motion, even in the brain, there's significant non-rigid motion, and that comes from cardiac pulsatility. So you have a bunch of blood flow into the head, you have a fixed size casing, right? There's nothing that can be done to accommodate blood coming in except for tissue to go out. And the brain actually pulsates a kind of disturbing amount due to the cardiac cycle. And in fact, what happens in particular is regions in the brainstem and going down into the spine, they actually deflect down through the foramen magnum in the back of your skull. It's often described as being as if you're sort of tugging on the spine, which is really creepy. But that happens throughout the cardiac cycle. So you really can't avoid motion, even in the brain, okay, let alone getting into other parts of the body. So for that reason, the most common thing that we do for acquiring an image is to use single-shot EPI because it freezes motion. We get the image in one go, and then any motion is frozen in a snapshot. So it's not necessarily because we need the images to be fast that we use EPI. The single most critical reason why we use it is because it freezes motion. Okay, and I'll come back later to ways that we can try and get around this. One of the upshots of this then is that these images have pretty serious distortion and limited resolution, and that's the real downside. Okay, so distortion, where does distortion come from? I'm sure many of you know this, but I think it is kind of useful to walk through where it comes from, because the various ways that we can try to reduce distortion really relate to the mechanisms for its formation. So what I'm showing you here are the gradients that are played out during an EPI acquisition. And so you see here, this is the readout where we're going bang, 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 right and left. And then this phase encoding gradient is slowly moving us up from one end of K-space to the other. So you can think of this as creating fast and slow axes, right? This is a fast axis where we're bouncing back and forth, right to left. This is the axis where we're slowly moving from bottom to top. So let's just approximate these gradients in a way to try and understand where these artifacts come from. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to ignore the fact that, some of these readouts are negative gradients, some are positive, and just make them all positive. It makes our lives simpler. And then, actually, let's just time average them. Let's not worry about the fact that these things are changing over time, because what we need to worry about is how these gradients over the long duration of the readout behave. So if we think about that, then if we look in this fast direction, so this is the direction where we're moving right to left, the gradient that we're using, okay, so when we, actually let me go back, so this readout gradient here along the fast direction is relatively high. This phase encode gradient here is relatively low. So what does that fast gradient look like? It might look like this. So this is just color coding representing a gradient along the right-left direction. So that is the field that we think we have. That's the field we think we have perfect, exquisite control over. And that is the only thing that is affecting the rate of precession and the magnetization in that right-left direction. Okay, but in reality, we have errors in these fields. And that is, for most prominently, the error that the head itself induces when you put it into the magnetic field. It distorts the magnetic field in a very characteristic way. So for example, here above the sinuses, we would have a field distortion. So in reality then, we don't have this field, we have this field. So if we look in that fast direction and we compare the field that we actually have to the field that we think we have, it's actually not that dissimilar. Okay? So the percent error is relatively low. And so in this fast direction, we actually do a pretty good job of encoding spatial information where we think it is. If we now look to, so that total field then has pretty negligible errors associated with it. If we now look along the slow direction, so this is the, in this case, this is the vertical direction, our expected field, remember, is much lower because this is the slow direction that we're moving. Okay? So if our expected field looks like this, we again superimpose on top of that the same error. And now what you see is that the actual field that we have deviates quite significantly from the field that we think we have control over. And so the percent error is much higher. And so as a result, when I try to attribute signal from a given region here to relate it to the gradient that I think I have, signal that I think is here is actually, in this case, I've gone for a fairly extreme example, it would actually be even outside of the image field of view, right? So in other words, we think when we try to place signal according to its frequency, we get it wrong. We put the signal in the wrong place, and that leads to distortions. And so you see right here in the region where we have this largest error, we put the signal in the wrong place, okay? And so our images are very distorted. Okay, so what can we do about this? Well, one thing we can do is to use parallel imaging. So hopefully most of you will have heard of this. The basic idea is that you have a series of coils that you use to receive the signal. Those coils are placed in different locations around the head, and each of them are maximally sensitive to parts of the anatomy that are immediately adjacent to that coil. So what this should immediately tell you is that those coils have intrinsically some spatial information to them. If this coil sees a signal that's high and this coil sees a signal that's low, it kind of tells you that it's probably closer to this coil. So what that allows us to do then is to skip parts of K-space. So what that looks like in the case of EPI is, for example, it allows us to skip every other line. Okay? So if we look at what happens if we skip every other line, and then we use this coil information to fill in the missing lines in reconstruction, what we've enabled ourselves to do is to increase the strength of this slow gradient. Okay? So what does that effect does that have on the image? Here, if we were unaccelerated, the percent error would be relatively high. Yeah, okay, you can see that there's that gradient is a bit stronger there in the accelerated image, and so the percent error is lower. And so what that directly results in is lower distortions in the image. So here what I'm showing you are two example EPI images. On the left, there's no parallel imaging excitation. In the middle, there's a twofold excitation. And then what I'm showing you are images where I'm flipping back and forth between whether I go from bottom to top or top to bottom. And that has the effect of reversing the distortions. And this is a really useful way of gauging distortions in your images. And you can see that the distortions are much reduced when we use parallel imaging. So I'm going to quickly go through another advance that has been quite important in reducing scan times in diffusion imaging. So this is basically an adaptation of EPI that has really taken the field by storm in the last few years. So in general, the scan times that we have in diffusion imaging directly relate to two things. The first is the number of diffusion-weighted directions that we want to acquire, and the second is the time that it takes to acquire each individual volume. So in general then, most of us, when we go about designing a study, we sort of accept that there's a certain amount of time we can keep a subject in the scanner, or we want to minimize the amount of time that we keep the subject in the scanner. And so if we want to keep the scan time as short as possible, there are two things we could do. We could reduce the number of directions. In general, we don't want to do that because that imparts useful information. Or we can try and reduce this repetition time. So what dictates the repetition time? It's basically the time per slice and the number of slices that we have. So traditionally, for example, we would just repeat this from one slice to the next, and basically when we get to the end, we would go back and acquire data with a different diffusion direction. So what can we do to make this faster? Well, if you look at it, fundamentally, the problem is that we have to repeat this diffusion preparation for each slice independently. So one of the things that came along recently, which also takes advantage of coils, is the idea of not just using coil information to reduce distortions in plane, but actually to accelerate acquisition by simultaneously exciting multiple slices. So if you look, for example, here, slices 1, 4, and 7, you can see that if we have coils that are distributed in the vertical direction, those coils also provide ability to separate signal from different slices. And so what we've effectively done is we have a single diffusion preparation that we're sharing amongst many slices. And so we're essentially multiplexing the signal. And so this directly enables us to reduce either the time that it takes to get a fixed number of diffusion directions, or it enables us to get more diffusion directions per unit time. So that's kind of a major sort of improvement on EPI that's come about in the last few years. And for example, that's enabled people to take techniques like diffusion spectrum imaging, which are very time intensive, and reduce them to durations that are much more feasible in sort of less compliant subjects or even patients. Okay, so very briefly, let me touch on what else can be done in image acquisition. So what I showed you early on is that we use EPI because it's single shot, because it freezes motion. Because remember, multi-shot, if we, for example, were to acquire acquire the even lines in one acquisition and the odd lines in another acquisition and then try to combine them, we would in general get images that look like this. Okay, so very briefly, where does that motion, where do those motion artifacts come from? So if we have no motion, then if we look at the signal magnitude and the signal phase, we would expect to see something like this. This is a beautiful, implausibly well-behaved phase image, okay, which might have this beautiful K-space associated with it. If we have motion in the presence of diffusion gradients, so let's say the subject just shifts their head slightly, or actually, as it turns out, rotates their head slightly, you might get a phase image that looks like this. And what that phase ramp does is it shifts the center of K-space, so you can see it's slightly shifted here. Okay, so if we were to fully sample each of these K-spaces, we would be fine. They would be consistent. They would be self-consistent. We would get a perfectly usable image. But if we sample them over two periods, one with motion and one without motion, then the sampled K-space now is going to look like this. It's going to be jumbled, okay, because we have an inconsistent K-space between those two periods. And so if you look at the result of that, then you might, for example, get ghosting. And those of you who are astute will notice that my ghosting here is totally wrong. I've got it along the readout direction rather than the phase encode direction. So good for you if you spotted that. Okay, so it leads to image artifacts. So what can we do? Well, one thing we can do is to try to measure that motion, measure it in terms of that kind of a phase that's varying over time in a way that relates to motion. And here what I'm showing you is a time series of image phase in a diffusion acquisition, and actually what you're looking at is that same cardiac pulsatility. You're seeing beating of the heart in the brain. Okay? So what we can do is we can basically measure that phase just from the center of K-space because we happen to know that it should be slowly varying across the brain, and then we can try to correct it. And so, for example, here, this is an image where without any correction, you have a strong signal loss in this part of the brain, and if you basically remove this phase in a way that's actually quite akin to sense reconstructions in parallel imaging, for those of you who know that, you can get rid of these artifacts. So what does that look like in general? Well, in general, the most obvious thing you can do is basically, in addition to your image acquisition that's high resolution, you can tack on an additional little acquisition that just measures that phase. So for example, this is one of the first techniques that Kim Butts proposed, where she included a little quick acquisition immediately before segmented EPI, and she used this to measure that phase and correct it from this data. But people subsequently went on and they've proposed many different ways of achieving this, including propeller, variable density spirals, and a technique that we've worked with quite a lot called readout segmented EPI. In all cases, the upside of this is that you can achieve high resolution and low distortion images. So hopefully you can see that these images are all much nicer than the EPI images that I was showing you before. The problem, and this is a continuing problem which people are beginning to solve, is that these acquisition techniques are slow, because instead of getting a single an image every excitation, you have to use multiple excitations before you can form the image in full. Okay. Finally, another thing that people have explored that has benefits are 3D acquisitions. And so here I'm showing you, for example, what a 3D multi-slab excitation might look like. So instead of exciting a slice in our volume, we excite a thick slab. Okay? And then we acquire multiple slabs to complete the volume, kind of similar to how we would fill out multiple 2D slices in order to create a volume. But here, it's kind of a hybrid technique. We excite multiple slabs, and then within each slab, you have to encode in that Z direction using 3D encoding. Okay? The reason why we might want to do this is because it actually turns out to be highly compatible with a very short TR, or actually in some ways a sort of a moderately short TR between sort of 2 and 4 seconds, which should be the most SNR optimal thing to do. It should give you the most bang for your buck in terms of the amount of signal that you get. If you do this, there's various artifacts. Again, as soon as you start deviating from what's normal, you start to encounter new problems. One major problem of these 3D multi-slab techniques is that they have what's called this Venetian blind artifact. And it turns out to be surprisingly difficult to remove this artifact, but with kind of clever reconstruction techniques, you can remove those artifacts and get an image that looks relatively homogeneous. And for example, this is something that we've been working on, demonstrating this at 7T, showing whole brain imaging at sort of 1 millimeter resolution in not too long of a time. And you can start to pull out really beautiful, so this is probabilistic tractography here of the cingulum bundle, and you can start to see the sort of details of connections which you don't normally see at lower spatial resolution. And for example, if you compare that to a very high resolution postmortem scan, you see that it's really starting to capture some of the fine details of the tracks. Okay, so with that, I will mostly leave it. Basically, the upshot of all of this is diffusion-weighted spin echoes with EPI are dominant. They're dominant for a good reason, but there are a number of situations where it makes sense to deviate from them, and it's entirely possible that some of these techniques, as they gain ground, will become more common. So for example, diffusion-weighted stimulated echoes or steady-state techniques, navigated. I didn't have time to get into zoomed image acquisition today. And then finally, there's quite a few other aspects of sequences that I didn't have time to get into. For example, the effects of eddy currents, which are another major issue that we have to deal with. So thank you very much.